Sometimes the most desperate moments in life force us to make choices that change everything. We've all been in situations where we had to choose between what's safe and what's right, even when the cost seems too high to pay. In the dusty gold rush town of Red Hollow, Clara Vance sits behind iron bars, waiting for a death sentence she doesn't deserve. Once the daughter of the town's most respected businessman, she's now branded an outlaw for robbing her own father's stagecoach. The evidence is clear, the trial is over, and the gallows are being built. But when wealthy cattle baron's son Everett Blackthorne visits her cell out of curiosity, Clara makes him an offer that will shake both their worlds. "If you save me from this cage, I'll marry you," she whispers, her eyes filled with both desperation and fire. What Everett doesn't know is that Clara's arrest is part of a bigger conspiracy involving his own family's empire. Will a marriage born from desperation become something real, or will the truth destroy them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows through the iron bars of the Red Hollow jailhouse, painting stripes of light and darkness across Clara Vance's weathered hands. She sat on the narrow cot, her fingers wrapped around her father's gold pocket watch, the only possession they'd allowed her to keep. The familiar weight of it brought back memories of better times, when she wore silk dresses instead of rough cotton, when her biggest worry was which suitor her father would approve of for Sunday dinner. That was before the gold dried up in her father's mine, before the debts mounted like storm clouds on the horizon, before Thomas Vance, the man who'd built half of Red Hollow with his own hands, took his pistol to his study one autumn evening and never came out alive. Clara pressed the watch to her ear, listening to its steady tick, the heartbeat of a life that no longer existed. She'd been 19 when her father died, left with nothing but his debts and a reputation that crumbled faster than a house built on sand. The mine foreman had disappeared the same night, taking the last of the gold with him. The creditors came knocking within the week. Red Hollow had been built on dreams and desperation, like most towns that sprouted up wherever someone whispered the word gold. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks, lined with false-fronted buildings that looked grander than they were. The saloons stayed busy from dawn till midnight, filled with miners spending their dust on whiskey and false hopes. The general store, the bank, the hotel, all of them owned by men who'd arrived with more money than sense and stayed because the profits were too good to leave. Among those men was Benjamin Blackthorne, who'd come west with a fortune made in cattle and had the wisdom to diversify into real estate, mining claims, and anything else that might turn a profit. His ranch sprawled across the valley like a small kingdom, with herds that darkened the hills for miles. He was a man who understood power, how to acquire it, and how to keep it. His son Everett was different. Where Benjamin was calculating, Everett was curious. Where the father saw opportunities, the son saw people. At 28, Everett had the kind of education that came from Eastern universities and the kind of restlessness that came from never having to worry about money. He read books that arrived on the monthly supply train, spoke 3 languages, and had a way of listening that made people forget he was the richest man in town. It was this curiosity that brought him to the jailhouse that morning. Sheriff Morrison looked up from his coffee, surprised to see the young Blackthorne standing in his doorway. "Morning, Everett. What brings you by?" "I wanted to see her," Everett said simply. "The woman who robbed the Morrison Creek stage." The sheriff's weathered face creased into a frown. "She ain't some circus attraction, son. She's a condemned woman." "I understand that. But I've heard the story, and something doesn't sit right with me." Morrison set down his cup with a heavy sigh. The story had been simple enough. Clara Vance, desperate and destitute, had waited along the Morrison Creek Trail with a rifle and a kerchief over her face. She'd stopped the stagecoach her father had once owned, demanded the strongbox, and made off with 3 months' worth of mine payroll. The evidence was clear. Witnesses identified her voice, her horse, even the distinctive silver buttons on her father's old coat. But Everett had grown up in Red Hollow, and he remembered Clara from before. She'd been the kind of girl who helped old Mrs. Henderson with her shopping, who organized church socials and read to the children at the schoolhouse. The Clara Vance, he remembered, wouldn't have hurt a fly, much less robbed a stagecoach. 5 minutes, Morrison said finally, but I'm staying right here. Clara looked up when she heard footsteps approaching her cell. She recognized Everett Blackthorne immediately. Everyone in Red Hollow knew the Blackthorne heir. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that never seemed to stay properly combed, and eyes the color of winter sky. He'd always been kind to her in the years before her father's death, tipping his hat when they passed on the street, asking after her health at church functions. "Miss Vance," he said quietly, stopping just outside the bars. She stood, smoothing her simple dress with dignity that hadn't been broken despite everything. "Mr. Blackthorne, I didn't expect to see you here. I wanted to ask you something." He glanced toward the sheriff, then back to her. "Did you do it?" Clara's hand tightened around the pocket watch. In the past year, she'd grown accustomed to people looking at her with suspicion, disgust, or pity. But Everett's gaze held something different, a willingness to believe, even when all evidence pointed to her guilt. "Does it matter what I say?" she asked. "The jury's already decided." "It matters to me." She studied his face, searching for the mockery or condescension she'd learned to expect. Instead, she found sincerity that made her heart ache with something she'd almost forgotten: hope. "No," she said quietly. "I didn't rob that stagecoach." Everett nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "Then who did?" "I don't know, but someone wanted me to hang for it." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Clara had spent months in this cell, turning the question over in her mind. Who would frame her for robbery? Who would benefit from her death? The answer remained as elusive as morning mist. "The execution is set for Friday," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her chest every night. 3 days from now. Everett's jaw tightened. "There has to be something we can do. An appeal, new evidence." "There's no evidence to find," Clara interrupted. "Whoever did this, they were thorough. They made sure every trail leads back to me." She turned away from him, unable to bear the compassion in his eyes. Kindness was a luxury she could no longer afford. It made the cage feel smaller, the future more hopeless. "Miss Vance," Everett said, his voice softer now, "if there was a way to save your life, would you take it, no matter the cost?" Clara's breath caught. She turned back to face him, her hand still clutching the watch that had marked the hours of her father's life and would soon mark the end of hers. "What kind of question is that, Mr. Blackthorne?" "An honest one." Their eyes met through the iron bars, and Clara saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. This wasn't idle curiosity anymore. This was a man contemplating something dangerous, something that could change both their lives forever. "Yes," she whispered, "I would take it." The sheriff's chair scraped against the floor, reminding them both that they weren't alone. But for that moment, it had felt like the world had shrunk to just the two of them, separated by bars, but connected by something neither could quite name. Everett touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, Miss Vance." "Good day, Mr. Blackthorne." She watched him walk away, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Only when he was gone did she allow herself to wonder what he'd meant by his question, and whether the hope blooming in her chest would turn out to be just another cruelty in a life that had already served her more than her share. Everett couldn't sleep that night. He paced the length of his bedroom in the Blackthorne mansion, his mind replaying every word of his conversation with Clara. The way she'd said, "I would take it," haunted him, the quiet desperation beneath her dignity cutting him deeper than he'd expected. He'd known Clara before her father's downfall, had admired her from a distance at church socials and town gatherings. She'd been untouchable then, not because of social standing, but because of her character too pure, Too good for a man who'd spent his youth gambling and drinking his way through Boston before his father dragged him home to learn responsibility. But the woman in that cell wasn't the untouchable angel from his memories. She was flesh and blood, facing death with a courage that humbled him. And despite everything, the evidence, the conviction, the whispers that followed her name, he believed her. The next morning, he rode to the jailhouse before Sheriff Morrison had finished his coffee. This time, he brought something with him, a leather portfolio containing legal documents he'd borrowed from his father's study. "Back again?" Morrison asked, raising an eyebrow. "Son, I know your daddy taught you to be charitable, but this woman's beyond help." "Maybe," Everett said, "but I need to speak with her. Privately." Morrison's face darkened. "Can't do that, Everett. Regulations, $500, Everett said quietly, "for the new roof your office needs." The sheriff's protest died in his throat. $500 was more than he made in 6 months. He looked around his cramped, leaking office, then at the earnest young man who'd always been generous with the church collection plate. 10 minutes, Morrison said finally, "and I'll be right outside that door." Clara looked up when Everett approached her cell, surprised to see him again so soon. This time, something was different in his manner, a tension that hadn't been there yesterday, a purpose that made her pulse quicken. "Miss Vance," he said, glancing toward the door where Morrison waited, "I have a proposition for you." She stood slowly, brushing dust from her skirt. "What kind of proposition?" Everett pulled a document from his portfolio, unfolding it carefully. "A marriage contract, legally binding, recognized by the territorial government." Clara's breath caught. She moved closer to the bars, close enough to see the careful legal script, the official seals. "I don't understand." "Marriage would give you certain protections under territorial law," Everett explained quietly. "As my wife, you couldn't be executed without a hearing before the territorial judge in Carson City. It would buy us time to find the real evidence, time to prove your innocence." "You'd marry me," the words came out as barely a whisper. "A convicted criminal? You said you'd take any chance to save your life. I'm offering you that chance." Clara stared at the document, her mind reeling. Marriage to Everett Blackthorne would save her life, at least temporarily, but it would also tie her to a man she barely knew, a man whose family controlled half the territory. "What would you get from this arrangement?" she asked. "Besides a wife with a criminal record?" Everett folded the contract, his eyes meeting hers through the bars. "The chance to do something right for once in my life. Your family would disown you." "Maybe, but that's my concern, not yours." Clara's hand moved instinctively to her father's pocket watch, seeking its familiar comfort. "If I agreed to this, what would happen? How would it work?" "Judge Whitman is required by law to perform marriages for condemned prisoners. It's an old statute, rarely used. We'd have the ceremony tomorrow, before the execution date. Then I'd file an immediate appeal with the territorial court, and if the appeal fails..." Everett was quiet for a long moment. "Then at least you die as an honorable woman, with a name that means something in this territory." The weight of the decision pressed down on Clara like a stone. Marriage to Everett would save her life, but it would also ruin his. His father would never forgive him for marrying a convicted criminal. His social standing, his inheritance, his future, all of it would be at risk. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this for someone you barely know?" "Because I remember who you were before," he said simply, "and I don't believe that person could rob a stagecoach." Clara's throat tightened with emotion she couldn't afford to show. "You could be wrong about me." "I could be. But I'd rather be wrong and try to save an innocent woman than be right and let her die." She turned away from him, walking to the small window that looked out over Main Street. Red Hollow was waking up shopkeepers opening their doors, miners heading to the hills, children running to school. Normal life, continuing as if her world wasn't about to end. "If I say yes," she said without turning around, "and we find proof of my innocence, what then? Would you want a real marriage?" "We'd face that question when we come to it." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her father's watch in her palm. Thomas Vance had been a man of honor, a man who took care of his responsibilities. What would he want her to do? She turned back to Everett, decision crystallizing in her mind. "If you save me from this cage, I'll marry you," she said, the words steady and sure. "But I won't be just a name on a legal document. If we do this, I'll be a real wife to you in all the ways that matter." Everett's eyes widened slightly. He'd expected gratitude, perhaps relief. He hadn't expected this quiet strength, this dignity in the face of desperation. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," Clara interrupted. "If you're willing to risk everything for me, then I'm willing to risk everything for you. A marriage of convenience would dishonor us both." Everett studied her face, seeing not the desperate criminal the town believed her to be, but a woman of character facing an impossible situation with grace. "Then we have an agreement." He held out the contract through the bars. Clara took it, her fingers brushing his in the exchange. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through both of them, a spark that had nothing to do with legal arrangements or desperate bargains. "Tomorrow morning," Everett said, "Judge Whitman will perform the ceremony at 9 o'clock. And then we fight for your life together." Clara folded the contract carefully, holding it against her chest like a shield. "Everett, may I call you that now?" "Of course. Thank you, not just for this, but for believing in me when no one else would." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that seemed both formal and intimate. "Until tomorrow, Mrs. Blackthorne." As he walked away, Clara sank onto her cot, the contract still pressed to her heart. Tomorrow she would become a married woman to a man she barely knew, in circumstances no bride should face. But for the first time in months, she had hope. And hope, she was learning, was the most dangerous thing of all. Word traveled fast in Red Hollow. By sunset, half the town knew that Everett Blackthorne intended to marry the woman in their jail. The other half learned about it over breakfast the next morning, when Judge Whitman made the announcement at Miller's restaurant, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd performed more funerals than weddings in his 20 years on the bench. Benjamin Blackthorne heard the news from his foreman, Jake Morrison, the sheriff's younger brother, who rode out to the ranch before dawn with his hat in his hands and worry written across his weathered face. "Sir, I thought you should know before it's done," Jake said, standing in the doorway of Benjamin's study like a man delivering news of a death in the family. Benjamin set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision, his grey eyes fixed on the younger man. "Explain. Your son's planning to marry Clara Vance. This morning, Judge Whitman's agreed to perform the ceremony in the jail." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Benjamin Blackthorne had built his fortune on careful decisions and calculated risks. His son marrying a condemned criminal fell into neither category. "Thank you, Jake. That will be all." Jake hesitated. "Sir, do you want me to—" "I said that will be all." When he was alone, Benjamin walked to the window that overlooked his empire. Thousands of acres stretched to the horizon, marked by fence posts and grazing cattle. He'd built all of this for his son, shaped every decision with Everett's future in mind. Now the boy was about to throw it all away for a woman he barely knew. But Benjamin hadn't survived the Indian Wars and the cattle drives by acting on emotion. He'd learned long ago that every problem had a solution, and every man had a price. Meanwhile, in town, Clara was having her own morning visitors. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who ran the boarding house, had convinced Sheriff Morrison to let her bring Clara a proper dress for the wedding, a simple blue cotton that had belonged to her late daughter. "Every bride deserves to look her best," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice gruff with emotion she was trying to hide. "Even under circumstances like these." Clara held the dress up to the light, seeing the careful stitching, the small pearl buttons. "Mrs. Henderson, I can't accept this. It's too precious." "Nonsense. Mary would have wanted it used for something hopeful, not gathering dust in my wardrobe." The older woman's eyes were bright with tears. "That Blackthorne boy, he's a good man. You could do worse for a husband." even one who's only marrying me to save my life." Mrs. Henderson reached through the bars and patted Clara's hand. "Honey, half the marriages in this territory started with less noble intentions. At least yours begins with kindness." As Clara changed into the wedding dress, she caught her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, thinner than she'd been a year ago, with shadows under her eyes and lines of worry around her mouth. But wearing Mrs. Henderson's daughter's dress, she looked like a bride instead of a condemned woman. The ceremony itself was simple and strange. Judge Whitman performed it in the main room of the jailhouse, with Sheriff Morrison and his deputy as witnesses. Clara stood with her back to the jail cells, Everett beside her in his best suit, both of them speaking vows that felt surreal under the circumstances. "Do you, Everett James Blackthorne, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." "Do you, Clara Elizabeth Vance, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Clara's voice was steady. "I do. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Nevada, I now pronounce you husband and wife." There was no kiss, no celebration. Everett slipped a simple gold band onto Clara's finger, his grandmother's ring, borrowed from his mother's jewelry box without permission. Clara looked at it in wonder, this symbol of a marriage born from desperation but sealed with genuine hope. "Mrs. Blackthorne," Judge Whitman said formally, "your husband's attorney has filed an appeal with the territorial court. Your execution has been stayed pending their review." Clara felt her knees go weak with relief. She was still in a jail cell, still facing an uncertain future, but she was alive, and she was married to a man who'd risked everything to save her. After the small wedding party dispersed, Clara and Everett had a few moments alone. They sat on opposite sides of the cell bars, husband and wife, separated by iron and circumstance. "What happens now?" Clara asked. "Now we wait," Everett replied. "The territorial judge will review your case within 30 days. In the meantime, my attorney is investigating the robbery, looking for evidence that was missed. And your family?" Everett's expression darkened. "My father requested a meeting this afternoon. I suspect it won't be pleasant." Clara reached through the bars and touched his hand. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to come between you and your family." "You didn't choose this situation, Clara. We both just made the best of it we could." The sound of heavy footsteps interrupted them. Sheriff Morrison appeared, looking uncomfortable. "Everett, your father's here. He wants to speak with you." Everett squeezed Clara's hand before standing. "I'll be back tomorrow." "Everett," Clara called as he walked away. "Thank you for everything." He smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "You're welcome, Mrs. Blackthorne." After he left, Clara sat on her cot and fingered the gold ring on her finger. She was a married woman now, though she'd never felt less certain about her future. The appeal would buy her time, but time for what? To prove her innocence? To build a real marriage with a man she barely knew? To say goodbye properly when the territorial court upheld her conviction? Outside her window, Red Hollow went about its daily business, unaware that its newest bride was still locked behind iron bars, wearing a borrowed dress, and wondering if hope was just another kind of prison. The Blackthorne study smelled of leather and tobacco, the walls lined with books and hunting trophies that spoke of a man comfortable with power. Benjamin stood behind his massive oak desk when Everett entered, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. "Close the door," Benjamin said quietly. Everett complied, then moved to stand before the desk like a schoolboy, called to account for his misdeeds. But he wasn't a schoolboy anymore, and the gold ring on his finger proved it. "Explain yourself," Benjamin commanded. "There's nothing to explain. I married a woman I believe to be innocent of the crimes she's accused of committing." "Believe?" Benjamin's voice rose slightly. "You've staked your entire future, our family's reputation on a belief?" "Yes." The simple answer hung in the air between them. Benjamin had expected justifications, excuses, perhaps even defiance. He hadn't expected this calm certainty from his son. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Benjamin walked around the desk, his voice controlled but dangerous. The territorial governor is a personal friend. Judge Harrison in Carson City owes me 3 favors. I could have had that woman's conviction overturned with a telegram and a handshake. Everett felt something cold settle in his stomach. What are you saying? I'm saying you didn't need to marry her to save her life. You just needed to ask your father for help. The words hit Everett like a physical blow. All of it, the desperate proposal, the hurried wedding, the risk to his reputation, it had all been unnecessary. He could have simply asked his father to intervene, and Clara would have been free. But you didn't know I was going to ask, Everett said slowly. You would have let her hang. Benjamin's expression didn't change. I would have let justice take its course, even if she was innocent. Justice isn't about innocence or guilt, son. It's about maintaining order. That woman was convicted by a jury of her peers. Whether she actually committed the crime is less important than the appearance of law and order being maintained. Everett stared at his father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. This wasn't the honorable cattle baron he'd grown up admiring. This was a man who valued control more than truth, order more than justice. She is innocent, Everett said firmly, and she's my wife now. A marriage that can be annulled. She's a convicted felon, Everett. The courts will view any marriage to her as coerced or fraudulent, not if she's exonerated. Benjamin smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. That won't happen. You seem very certain of that. I am certain of very little in this world, but I'm certain of this. Clara Vance will hang for robbery, whether as your wife or as a spinster. The only difference is whether you destroy yourself in the process. Everett felt something shift inside him, an understanding that made him sick to his stomach. You know something about the robbery. Something you're not telling me. Benjamin walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. I know that sometimes justice needs assistance. Sometimes the guilty party isn't the one who gets caught, but someone who deserves punishment for other reasons. What other reasons? Clara never hurt anyone. Her father owed debts all over the territory when he died, debts that his estate couldn't cover. Someone had to pay the price for Thomas Vance's failures. So you framed his daughter? Benjamin turned from the window, his eyes cold. I didn't frame anyone. I simply didn't work very hard to prevent a convenient solution to multiple problems. Everett felt his world tilting. What problems? Thomas Vance owned land adjacent to our southern pasture, prime grazing land that I need for expansion. His daughter, as his heir, was blocking the sale. With her convicted and executed, the land reverts to the territorial government, which will be happy to sell it to a respected citizen at a fair price. You let an innocent woman be convicted so you could steal her land? I didn't steal anything. I'm following proper legal procedures. Everett took a step toward his father, his hands clenched into fists. You're talking about murder. Clara's murder. I'm talking about business. Benjamin's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. And you're going to forget this conversation happened. You're going to have that marriage annulled, and you're going to let nature take its course. No. The simple word seemed to echo in the study. Benjamin's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? I said no. I won't abandon my wife, and I won't let you profit from her death. Then you're no son of mine. The words were meant to wound, but instead they felt like liberation. Everett straightened his shoulders, feeling years of obligation and expectation fall away like shed skin. Then I guess I'm not, he said quietly. But I'm Clara's husband, and I'll honor that commitment. He turned to leave, but Benjamin's voice stopped him at the door. If you walk out that door, you're cut off. No inheritance, no support, no place in this family. You'll have nothing but a wife with a rope around her neck. Everett looked back at his father, seeing a stranger wearing a familiar face. Maybe that's enough. He left the study and the house where he'd grown up, mounting his horse with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline and determination. As he rode back toward town, he tried to process what he'd learned. His father hadn't just allowed Clara to be framed, he'd orchestrated it. The robbery had been real, but Clara hadn't committed it. Someone had, and that someone was working with Benjamin Blackthorne. The question was, who? And more importantly, how could he prove it in time to save his wife's life? As he rode through the gates of the Blackthorn Ranch for what might be the last time, Everett felt the weight of his grandmother's ring on his finger and thought of Clara sitting in that jail cell, waiting for news that might mean life or death. He'd given up his inheritance, his family, and his comfortable future. But he'd gained something too, a purpose worth fighting for, and a woman worth saving. Now he just had to figure out how to do it before time ran out. Clara was reading her father's Bible when Everett returned to the jailhouse that evening. The leather-bound book was another possession they'd allowed her to keep, its pages worn soft from years of Thomas Vance's nightly devotions. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, noting immediately that something had changed in his bearing. "How did it go with your father?" she asked, though his expression already told her most of what she needed to know. Everett pulled up the chair Sheriff Morrison kept for visitors, positioning it close to the bars. "Not well, but I learned some things that change everything." Clara set the Bible aside, giving him her full attention. "What kind of things?" Everett leaned forward, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to Morrison's office. "My father knows who really robbed that stagecoach. He's been protecting them because your conviction serves his purposes." "What purposes?" "Your father's land, the grazing acreage adjacent to our ranch. With you executed, it reverts to the territory, and he can buy it cheaply." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She'd known her conviction was convenient for someone, but she'd never imagined it was this calculated, this cold. "He's letting me hang for land. He's counting on it." Clara was quiet for a long moment, processing the enormity of what Everett had revealed. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. "What's funny?" Everett asked. "The land," Clara said, wiping tears from her eyes. "That worthless patch of scrub grass and rocks. My father tried to sell it for years. No one wanted it because the soil's too poor for crops and there's no water for cattle. It's adjacent to our best pasture. My father can dig wells, run irrigation lines. It's worthless to a small farmer, but valuable to someone with resources. So I'm going to die for dirt," Clara said quietly. "Daddy would be spinning in his grave." Everett reached through the bars and took her hand. "You're not going to die. We're going to find proof of who really committed that robbery." "How? If your father has been protecting them, they've had months to cover their tracks." "There's always evidence if you know where to look. The question is, who had access to information about stagecoach schedules and payroll deliveries? Who knew that route well enough to choose the perfect ambush spot? Who had reason to frame you specifically?" Clara considered his questions, her mind working through the possibilities. The stagecoach company keeps schedules, but they're not secret. Any merchant or miner could find out when deliveries were expected. What about the ambush site, the place where they stopped the coach? Morrison Creek Bridge. It's a natural bottleneck, the only place for miles where the road narrows between rocks. Anyone who's traveled that route would know it. Everett frowned, feeling like he was missing something obvious. "Tell me about the day you were arrested. What exactly happened?" Clara leaned back against the wall of her cell, remembering, "I was at home, the little house on Elm Street where I've been living since I sold the family place. Mrs. Patterson from next door was visiting, helping me with some sewing. Around 3 in the afternoon, Sheriff Morrison showed up with a warrant. What was the warrant based on? Witness testimony. 3 people identified me as the robber, my voice, my horse, my father's coat." "Your father's coat?" Clara nodded. "The one with silver buttons that he wore to church every Sunday. But here's the thing, Everett, I sold that coat months before the robbery. I needed money for rent, and Mrs. Chen at the general store said she had a customer who collected fine clothing." Everett sat up straighter. "You sold it? To whom?" "Mrs. Chen handled the transaction. She said the buyer wanted to remain anonymous, but they paid well above what the coat was worth." "That's our evidence," Everett said, excitement building in his voice. "If we can find out who bought the coat, we find our real robber." "Maybe, but Mrs. Chen's been dead for 2 months. Heart gave out in her sleep." Everett's excitement deflated, but only for a moment. Her records, the store records, would show the transaction. Her nephew took over the business when she died. Billy Chen, but he's not exactly cooperative with people asking questions about his aunt's dealings. Then we'll have to be persuasive. Clara squeezed his hand through the bars. Everett, you need to be careful. If your father is willing to let me hang for land, what do you think he'll do to you for interfering? I'm not afraid of my father. You should be. Men like him, men with power and money, they don't just threaten, they act, and they have resources we can't match. Everett was quiet for a moment, considering her words. She was right, of course. Benjamin Blackthorne had spent decades building a network of influence and obligation throughout the territory. Judges, lawmen, politicians, they all owed him favors or feared his displeasure. Then we'll have to be smarter than they are, he said finally. We? You're my wife now, Clara. That makes this our fight, not just mine. Clara felt something warm spread through her chest at his words. Despite everything, the circumstances of their marriage, the danger they faced, the uncertainty of their future, Everett was treating her as an equal partner, not just a woman to be rescued. Tomorrow, I'll talk to Billy Chen, Everett continued. See if I can convince him to let me look at his aunt's records. And if he won't, then I'll find another way. There's always another way. Clara studied his face in the lamplight, seeing determination mixed with something else, a kind of peace she hadn't expected. You've changed, she said, since this morning, since you talked to your father. Maybe, or maybe I'm just finally becoming who I was supposed to be all along. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands linked through the iron bars. Outside, Red Hollow was settling into evening saloon music, drifting on the night air, the distant sound of mining equipment being shut down for the day, the occasional clip-clop of horses carrying late travelers home. Everett, Clara said finally. Yes, when this is over, when we prove my innocence, what then? What do we do about us? It was the question that had been hovering between them since the moment they'd spoken their vows. Their marriage had been born from desperation, but it had created something real, a bond that went beyond legal documents and survival strategies. I don't know, Everett admitted, but I'd like to find out. Clara smiled, and for the first time since her arrest, it reached her eyes. So would I. The sound of footsteps in the outer office reminded them that their time was limited. Sheriff Morrison appeared, looking apologetic but firm. Time's up, Everett. You know the rules. Everett stood, reluctant to leave. I'll be back tomorrow. I'll be here, Clara replied, touching the gold ring on her finger. As Everett walked out into the night, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Somewhere in Red Hollow was the person who had really robbed that stagecoach, the person whose freedom depended on Clara's death. Tomorrow he would begin hunting them, using whatever resources and cunning he possessed. But tonight, for the first time since this all began, he felt something like hope, not just for Clara's freedom, but for their future together. Whatever that future might hold. Billy Chen was nothing like his aunt, where Mrs. Chen had been warm and welcoming, always ready with a story or a piece of hard candy for the children. Billy was sharp-eyed and suspicious, treating every customer like a potential thief. He looked up from his ledger when Everett entered the general store, his expression immediately wary. Mr. Blackthorne, surprised to see you here. Heard about your wedding yesterday. Congratulations. The word dripped with sarcasm. Everett ignored it, approaching the counter with the easy confidence that had served him well in business dealings back east. Thank you, Billy. I'm actually here about some business my wife mentioned, a coat she sold to your aunt a few months back. Billy's eyes narrowed. What about it? I'd like to know who bought it. The coat has sentimental value. It belonged to Clara's father, and I thought I might try to buy it back. Can't help you. Billy turned back to his ledger, making it clear the conversation was over. Everett pulled a $20 gold piece from his pocket and set it on the counter. I'd be willing to pay for the information. Billy glanced at the coin, then back at Everett. My aunt's business dealings were private. I don't go sharing customer information with anyone who walks in here with money, even when that information could save an innocent woman's life." "Innocent?" Billy laughed harshly. "Your wife robbed a stagecoach, Mr. Blackthorne. She's about as innocent as a rattlesnake." Everett felt his temper rising but forced himself to remain calm. "She was framed, Billy. Someone else committed that robbery while wearing her father's coat. Someone who knew she'd sold it to your aunt." For just a moment, something flickered in Billy's eyes, surprise, or maybe fear. But it was gone so quickly Everett might have imagined it. "Even if that were true, I can't help you. My aunt's records are private." Everett studied the younger man's face, noting the nervous way he kept glancing toward the back room of the store. "What aren't you telling me, Billy?" "Nothing. I just don't have the information you want. You haven't even looked at the records." "Don't need to. I remember the transaction. Some traveling merchant bought the coat, paid cash, and left town the same day. No name, no forwarding address." It was a lie. Everett could see it in the way Billy's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, the way he avoided eye contact. But calling him on it would only make him more defensive. "I see," Everett said, pocketing the gold piece. "Well, if you remember anything else, you know where to find me." As he turned to leave, Billy called after him. "Mr. Blackthorne, you might want to think about what you're doing. Stirring up trouble over a convicted criminal, it's not going to end well for you." "Is that a threat, Billy?" "It's friendly advice. From someone who knows how things work in this town." Everett left the store with more questions than answers. Billy Chen was lying, but why? What hold did someone have over him that would make him protect a robber and murderer? He was so lost in thought that he almost missed the figure stepping out of the alley beside the store. It was Jake Morrison, the sheriff's brother, and he looked like a man with something to say. "Everett," Jake called softly. "Got a minute?" They walked together toward the edge of town, away from curious ears and watching eyes. Jake was nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting to be followed. "You were asking Billy about that coat," Jake said finally. "You were listening." "Hard not to. Billy's voice carries when he's agitated." Jake stopped walking, his face troubled in the afternoon light. "There's something you should know about that transaction." "I'm listening." "I was there when the coat was sold. Billy's lying about it being a traveling merchant. The buyer was someone local, someone with good reason to want that coat for disguise purposes." Everett felt his pulse quicken. "Who?" Jake hesitated, fear and conscience warring in his expression. "If I tell you this, I'm a dead man. You understand that, right? This goes deeper than just one robbery." "How deep?" "Deep enough to reach the territorial capital, deep enough to involve men with money and power who don't like being crossed." "My father?" Jake nodded grimly. "Among others. There's a group of them, landowners, politicians, mining interests. They call themselves the Territorial Development Association. But they're really just a group of rich men who've figured out how to manipulate the legal system for profit. And Clara's conviction is part of that? Clara's conviction is just one move in a bigger game. They've been doing this for years, identifying properties they want, then finding ways to legally acquire them. Sometimes it's foreclosure on manufactured debts. Sometimes it's eminent domain for fake public works projects. In your wife's case, it was framing her for a crime that would result in property forfeiture. Everett felt sick. "Who bought the coat, Jake?" "My brother. Sheriff Morrison bought it." The words hit Everett like a physical blow. Sheriff Morrison, the man who'd arrested Clara, who guarded her cell, who'd performed the investigation, he was the real robber. He used her father's coat to frame her for his own crime? "It gets worse," Jake said quietly. "The robbery was commissioned. Morrison was hired to steal that payroll, and framing Clara was part of the job from the beginning." "Hired by whom?" "I think you already know the answer to that." Everett closed his eyes, feeling the pieces falling into place. His father hadn't just allowed Clara to be framed, he'd orchestrated the entire thing. The robbery, the frame-up, the conviction, all of it designed to get him the Vance property at a bargain price. "Why are you telling me this?" Everett asked. Because your wife doesn't deserve to hang for my brother's crime, and because I'm tired of being part of something that makes me sick to my stomach. Will you testify? Tell this to the territorial judge." Jake shook his head. "I can't. I've got a wife and kids, Everett. If I cross the association, they'll destroy my family. Then how do I prove it?" "You find evidence. Physical evidence that ties Morrison to the robbery. Without that, it's just your word against some very powerful men." As Jake melted back into the shadows, Everett stood alone at the edge of town, watching the sun set over the mountains. He now knew who had framed his wife and why. But knowing and proving were two different things entirely. And somewhere in Red Hollow, the real criminals were watching his every move, waiting for him to make a mistake that would cost Clara her life. Everett spent that night planning his next move. If Morrison was the real robber, there had to be evidence somewhere, the stolen payroll money, the coat, something that would prove Clara's innocence. But searching the sheriff's office or home would be impossible while Morrison was watching his every move. He needed help, and he knew exactly where to find it. The next morning, he rode out to the old mining camp where the Chinese workers lived. After the railroad construction ended, many had stayed to work the smaller claims that white miners had abandoned. They kept to themselves mostly, forming a tight community on the outskirts of Red Hollow. He found Chen Wei, Billy's uncle, tending a small vegetable garden behind his cabin. Chen Wei was older than his late sister, with the kind of quiet dignity that came from surviving hardship without losing one's soul. "Mr. Blackthorne," Chen Wei said, looking up from his plants, "I heard about your marriage and about your visit to my nephew's store. Then you know why I'm here." Chen Wei nodded slowly. "Billy is afraid. Since his aunt died, he's been pressured by powerful men to keep certain secrets." "What kind of secrets?" "The kind that get honest people killed." Chen Wei straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "My sister kept detailed records of every transaction, not just the official books that Billy shows customers, but private records too, records that might interest you." Everett felt hope stir in his chest. "Where are these records?" "Hidden. My sister was a careful woman who understood that knowledge could be dangerous. When she died, I took certain precautions to ensure her secrets remained safe. Will you show them to me?" Chen Wei studied Everett's face for a long moment. "You're risking everything for a woman you barely know. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. And if doing the right thing costs you your life." Everett thought of Clara sitting in that jail cell, wearing his grandmother's ring and facing death for a crime she didn't commit. "Then at least I'll die, knowing I tried." Chen Wei smiled, the first genuine warmth Everett had seen since this nightmare began. "Come, I'll show you what my sister preserved." They walked to a storage shed behind Chen Wei's cabin. Inside, hidden beneath bags of rice and preserved vegetables, was a wooden crate containing Mrs. Chen's private records. The old man lifted out a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with careful Chinese characters alongside English notations. "Here," Chen Wei said, pointing to an entry dated 3 months before the robbery. "The coat transaction." Everett leaned closer, reading the English notation. The buyer wasn't listed as anonymous or traveling merchant. It was clearly marked Tom Morrison, Sheriff's Office. Silver button coat, male, large, paid, 15 cash. Special delivery requested to Morrison Creek Cabin. "Morrison Creek Cabin?" Everett asked. "Old hunting lodge about 5 miles from where the robbery took place. Sheriff Morrison has used it for years." Everett felt pieces clicking into place in his mind. Morrison had bought the coat, stored it at his hunting cabin near the robbery site, then used it to disguise himself during the crime. But there was more. Chen Wei turned the page, revealing another entry that made Everett's blood run cold. "Payment received from B. Blackthorne for information services. 500 delivered list of C. Vance property holdings and financial status." His father had paid Mrs. Chen for information about Clara's finances, her property, her vulnerabilities. This wasn't just opportunistic crime, it was a carefully planned conspiracy. "There's more," Chen Wei said quietly, turning to another page. My sister was worried about these transactions. She made copies of certain documents, kept them as insurance. He pulled out a folded paper that had been tucked between the ledger's pages. It was a letter, written in his father's distinctive handwriting. Morrison, the Vance matter must be resolved before spring planting season. Ensure the robbery occurs along the Morrison Creek route, where terrain favors quick escape. The woman's conviction is essential for property transfer. Payment of 2-0 upon successful completion. Additional 1-0 when property deed transfers. Destroy this correspondence immediately. B. Everett stared at the letter, seeing his father's guilt laid out in black and white. Benjamin Blackthorne hadn't just enabled Clara's framing, he'd ordered it, planned it, paid for it. My sister was planning to go to the territorial authorities, Chenway said. She died before she could act on that plan. Died? Everett looked up sharply. I thought her heart gave out. So the doctor said. But my sister had the heart of a young woman, even at her age, and she'd been receiving threats in the weeks before her death. A chill ran down Everett's spine. You think she was murdered? I think powerful men don't like being exposed, and I think my sister's death was very convenient for certain people. Everett carefully folded the letter and tucked it into his jacket. This evidence, it's enough to clear Clara and convict the real criminals. If you can get it to honest authorities. The problem is finding any in this territory who aren't already bought and paid for by the association. Then I'll take it to Carson City myself, to the territorial judge handling Clara's appeal. Chenway nodded approvingly. But be careful, Mr. Blackthorne. Men like your father don't surrender their plans easily. They'll try to stop you by any means necessary. As Everett prepared to leave, Chenway handed him something else, a small Derringer pistol, its silver surface gleaming in the morning light. My sister's insurance policy, the old man said. She said if her records ever came to light, the person carrying them would need protection. Everett weighed the gun in his hand, feeling its deadly potential. He'd never killed a man, never even drawn a weapon in anger. But as he thought of Clara waiting in that jail cell, and of his father's willingness to murder for profit, he tucked the Derringer into his belt. Thank you, he said simply. Thank my sister by making sure justice is done. As Everett rode back toward town, his mind was already working on the logistics. Carson City was a 2-day ride, but he could make it in 36 hours if he pushed hard and changed horses. The territorial judge would have to act on evidence. This concrete, even if Benjamin Blackthorne had influence, he couldn't overcome documented proof of conspiracy and murder. But first, Everett had to tell Clara what he'd discovered. She deserved to know that her father-in-law had orchestrated her father's financial ruin, her own framing, and possibly Mrs. Chen's murder. She deserved to know that her marriage to Everett had made her even more of a target. And she deserved to know that despite everything, the conspiracy, the danger, the uncertain future, he was falling in love with her. The thought surprised him with its clarity. What had begun as a rescue mission had become something deeper, something that made the risk to his own life seem worthwhile. Now he just had to keep them both alive long enough to see justice done. Clara was pacing her cell when Everett arrived at the jailhouse, her father's Bible forgotten on the cot. She'd spent the night thinking about their conversation, about the dangerous game they were playing with powerful men. When she saw Everett's face, she knew immediately that something fundamental had changed. You found something, she said. I found everything. He glanced toward Sheriff Morrison's office, where the sound of papers rustling indicated the sheriff was at his desk. We can't talk here. Too dangerous. Clara nodded, understanding immediately. If Morrison was the real robber, every word they spoke in his jailhouse was potentially deadly. Tonight, Everett whispered, after Morrison goes home, I'll come back. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Clara tried to read, tried to pray, tried to occupy her mind with anything other than the growing certainty that they were running out of time. When Sheriff Morrison finally locked up his office and headed home for supper, she felt like she'd been holding her breath all day. Everett returned after dark, slipping in through the back door with a key he'd somehow acquired. Clara didn't ask how. There were some things it was better not to know. "We have to be quiet," he whispered, approaching her cell with a lantern turned low. Morrison could come back. "Tell me," Clara said simply. Everett laid out everything: Jake Morrison's confession, Mrs. Chen's secret records, his father's letter ordering the robbery. Clara listened in growing horror, her hand moving instinctively to her throat as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "Your father ordered all of this?" she whispered. "My father's ruin, my conviction, Mrs. Chen's death, and probably your father's suicide too, if Benjamin was manipulating Thomas's debts, driving him to desperation." "No." Clara's voice was firm despite the tears on her cheeks. "My father killed himself because he couldn't face the shame of losing everything. But knowing it was manufactured shame, knowing he was driven to it, that makes it murder just the same." Everett reached through the bars and took her hands. "I'm going to Carson City tomorrow. I'll take the evidence to Judge Harrison myself. It's too dangerous. If your father suspects what you're doing, he already knows I'm working against him. The question is how far he's willing to go to stop me." Clara squeezed his hands tighter. "Promise me something, Everett. If this goes wrong, if they catch you or kill you, don't let them make it seem like suicide. Don't let them add your death to their collection. I promise, but you have to promise me something too." "What?" "If I don't make it back, if something happens to me on the road, don't." Clara's voice was fierce. "Don't you dare talk like that. Listen to me. If I don't make it back, Chen Wei has copies of all the evidence. Go to him when they release you for transport to Carson City. He'll help you get the truth to someone who can act on it." "When they release me?" "Everett, my appeal was denied this afternoon. Morrison told me just before he left. The execution is back on day after tomorrow." The words hit Everett like a physical blow. He'd known time was running short, but he'd thought they had more, at least another week, while the territorial court deliberated. "That's impossible. Appeals take time to review. Unless they're expedited by someone with influence." Clara's voice was bitter. "Your father doesn't take chances, does he?" Everett felt panic rising in his chest. Carson City was 2 days away, and Clara had less than 48 hours to live. Even if he rode without stopping, changed horses twice, pushed himself and his mount to the breaking point, he might not make it in time. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "There is." Clara's voice was quiet but determined. "You break me out of here tonight." "Clara, no. If you run, you'll be branded an escaped convict, even if we prove your innocence later. There won't be a later if I'm dead." She leaned closer to the bars, her eyes fierce in the lamplight. "I won't sit here like a lamb waiting for slaughter while your father profits from my death." Everett stared at her, seeing not the refined merchant's daughter he remembered from church socials, but a woman forged by hardship into someone willing to fight for her life. "If we do this, there's no going back," he said quietly. "We'll be fugitives together. We're already fugitives, Everett. Your father made sure of that the moment you married me." She was right, and they both knew it. Benjamin Blackthorne wouldn't be satisfied with just Clara's death now, not when Everett knew too much, had too much evidence. They were both marked for elimination, whether they ran or stayed. "Where would we go?" he asked, his mind already working on logistics. "Mexico. It's only a week's ride south, and they don't extradite for territorial crimes. A week's ride through desert and mountain passes, with every lawman in 3 territories looking for us. Better than a short drop with a long rope." Everett looked into her eyes and saw his own determination reflected there. She was right. Running was their only chance now. But it would mean abandoning everything they'd known, starting over in a foreign country with nothing but the evidence that could clear her name. "The evidence," he said suddenly. "If we run, how do we get it to the authorities?" "We don't run far, just far enough to stay alive while you get word to honest lawmen. There have to be somewhere in this territory. Judge Parker in Denver. He's got a reputation for integrity, and he owes my father nothing." Then that's our destination, not Mexico, Denver. Everett nodded, his mind shifting from desperation to planning. I'll need supplies, horses, weapons. Morrison keeps the cell keys in his desk. I saw him put them there this afternoon. How do we get past the night deputy? What night deputy? Morrison's too cheap to pay for overnight coverage. He locks up and goes home, figures the cells will hold till morning. Clara smiled grimly. Then we'd better make sure they don't. As they finalized their desperate plan, neither of them noticed the shadow that detached itself from the building across the street, or the figure that slipped away into the darkness to report what it had overheard. Benjamin Blackthorne had not built an empire by leaving things to chance. He'd been watching his son's every move, anticipating exactly this moment, and he was ready for it. But then again, so was Everett. The derringer Chen Wei had given him was a small comfort against the forces arrayed against them, but it was better than nothing. And Clara had proven herself to be far more formidable than anyone had expected. Tomorrow night, they would either escape together or die together. But they wouldn't go quietly into the darkness Benjamin Blackthorne had prepared for them. The next evening came with unusual quiet in Red Hollow. No miners singing in the saloon, no late-night card games spilling onto the streets. Even the dogs seemed to sense that something was about to happen, keeping to their yards with nervous whines. Everett waited in the alley behind the jailhouse, a pack of supplies on his back and 2 horses tied quietly in the shadows. He'd spent the day making careful preparations, buying provisions from different merchants so no one would suspect, arranging for fresh horses at strategic points along the route to Denver, even writing a letter to Judge Parker explaining the situation in case they didn't survive the journey. At 11 o'clock, Sheriff Morrison's lamp went out in his house down the street. Everett counted to 100, then slipped around to the front of the jailhouse. The lock was simple, the kind that yielded to patience and a steady hand with a thin blade. Inside, Clara was waiting by her cell door, dressed in the practical riding clothes. Mrs. Henderson had brought her earlier, claiming they were for when this all gets sorted out. She'd known, somehow, that Clara would need them tonight. Any trouble? Clara whispered. None yet. Everett moved to Morrison's desk, searching through the drawers for the cell keys. But the night's young. He found the keys in the bottom drawer, underneath a stack of wanted posters and territorial correspondence. As he lifted them out, one of the papers caught his eye, a telegram dated that morning. Confirm Vance woman eliminated tomorrow. Blackthorne's son also compromised. Handle both problems simultaneously. Make it look like escape attempt gone wrong. Territory will compensate appropriately. Everett's blood turned to ice. They weren't just planning Clara's execution, they were planning to kill them both and make it look like she'd died, trying to escape, taking him with her. What is it? Clara asked, seeing his expression. Change of plans. He unlocked her cell with hands that shook slightly. They're not waiting for the execution. They're coming tonight. Clara read the telegram over his shoulder, her face pale but determined. How long do we have? I don't know, but we need to... The sound of horses approaching cut him off. Multiple riders, moving at a careful pace that suggested they were trying to be quiet. Everett blew out the lantern and moved to the window, peering through the curtains. 6 men on horseback had stopped in front of the jailhouse. Even in the moonlight, he recognized his father's distinctive silhouette, along with Sheriff Morrison and 4 men he didn't know hired guns, probably, brought in from outside the territory. Back door, Everett whispered urgently. But as they moved toward the rear of the building, Clara grabbed his arm. Listen, more horses, coming from the direction of the back alley where Everett had left their mounts. They were surrounded. The roof, Clara said. There's a ladder in Morrison's office that leads to the roof access. They climbed quickly but carefully, trying not to make noise on the wooden rungs. The roof was flat, typical of frontier construction, with a low parapet around the edges. From their position, they could see the men surrounding the building, a carefully planned operation designed to eliminate any possibility of escape. Benjamin Blackthorn's voice carried clearly in the still night air. "Morrison, you take the front. I want this done quickly and quietly. No witnesses, no complications." "What about the bodies?" Morrison asked. "Tragic accident. Desperate woman takes hostage during escape attempt, both killed in the struggle. You'll be hailed as a hero for trying to save young Blackthorn's life." Clara touched Everett's arm, pointing toward the building next door. It was close, maybe 8 feet across the alley, and its roof was slightly lower. "If they could make the jump, too far," Everett whispered, "and too dangerous. More dangerous than staying here?" She had a point. Below them, they could hear boots on the jailhouse steps, voices giving orders. In minutes, maybe seconds, Morrison would discover the empty cell and raise the alarm. "You first," Everett said. "I'll be right behind you." Clara shook her head. "Together. If one of us doesn't make it, the other stays too." Before Everett could argue, she was moving, running toward the edge of the roof, with the kind of desperate courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. She leaped across the alley gap, landing hard on the neighboring roof, but managing to keep her footing. Everett followed, his longer stride giving him an advantage in the jump. He landed next to Clara, both of them breathing hard from adrenaline and exertion. Behind them, shouts erupted from the jailhouse. "They're gone! Cell's empty! Find them!" Benjamin's voice was ice-cold with fury. "They can't have gotten far." From their position on the neighboring roof, Everett and Clara could see their original escape route was blocked. The horses he'd arranged were surrounded by armed men. But there was another option. The old mining office across the street had an external staircase leading down to an alley that connected to the main road out of town. "Can you make another jump?" Everett asked. Clara looked across the street to the mining office roof. It was farther than the first jump, and the building was taller. If they missed, it would be a 20-foot fall to the street below. "Do we have a choice?" They didn't. Below them, search parties were fanning out through the streets, lanterns bobbing as men checked every shadow, every potential hiding place. Soon they'd think to check the rooftops. This time, Everett went first. He backed up several steps, then sprinted toward the edge of the roof. For a moment he was airborne, the street spinning below him, before he crashed onto the mining office roof with a jarring impact that knocked the wind from his lungs. Clara followed without hesitation, her smaller size working against her in the longer jump. She landed short, her hands scrabbling for purchase on the edge of the roof, while her legs dangled into space. Everett grabbed her wrists, hauling her up, just as voices echoed from the alley below. They'd been spotted. Gunshots erupted from the street below as Everett and Clara scrambled down the external staircase of the mining office. Bullets splintered the wooden steps around them, sending sharp fragments flying. They reached the alley just as Benjamin Blackthorn rounded the corner on horseback, a rifle in his hands. "End of the line," Benjamin said, his voice carrying the same cold authority he'd used in business meetings. "Step away from her, Everett. This doesn't have to involve you." "Like hell it doesn't." Everett pulled Clara behind him, drawing the Derringer Chen Wei had given him. The small gun looked pitiful against his father's rifle, but it was all they had. "You're making a mistake, son. That woman has poisoned your mind against your own family." "No, father. You did that yourself." Everett's voice was steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "When you had Thomas Vance ruined, when you had Mrs. Chen murdered, when you ordered Clara framed for a crime, your sheriff committed." Benjamin's eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I have your letter, the one ordering Morrison to rob the stagecoach and frame Clara. Mrs. Chen kept copies of everything." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Benjamin's face. He'd burned his copy of that letter, but he'd forgotten about the old Chinese woman's meticulous record-keeping. "Even if that were true," Benjamin said, "who would believe it? The word of a dead woman and a convicted criminal against mine. Judge Parker in Denver might be interested." Everett took a step backward, pulling Clara with him toward the mouth of the alley. "Especially when he learns about the Territorial Development Association and how you've been manipulating the legal system for profit. You naive fool. You think one honest judge can change anything? I have connections from here to Washington. That evidence will never see a courtroom. Maybe not, but it'll see a newspaper. Several newspapers, in fact. Benjamin's face darkened with rage. I gave you everything, position, wealth, a future, and you threw it all away for a common criminal. She's not common, and she's not a criminal. She's my wife, and she's worth more than your entire dirty empire. Clara squeezed Everett's free hand, moved by his fierce defense of her. Even facing death, he was protecting her honor as much as her life. Sheriff Morrison appeared at the far end of the alley, cutting off their retreat. More men emerged from doorways and shadows. The net was closing around them. Enough talking, Benjamin said, raising his rifle. Morrison, take the woman alive if possible. I want her to stand trial properly. As for my son... The sound of hoofbeats interrupted him. 3 riders appeared at the mouth of the alley, their horses breathing hard from a fast ride. Everett's heart sank, thinking it was more of his father's men. Then he recognized the leader and felt a surge of hope. Judge Parker himself, flanked by 2 territorial marshals. "What's the meaning of this?" Parker demanded, his authoritative voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. Blackthorne, why are you pointing a rifle at your own son?" Benjamin's face went pale. "Judge Parker, I wasn't expecting, obviously not." Parker dismounted, his hand resting on his sidearm. "I received some very interesting documents by special courier this afternoon. Documents that suggest there's been a grave miscarriage of justice in Red Hollow." Chenway stepped out from behind one of the buildings, and Everett realized the old man had been working behind the scenes, getting the evidence to Denver by the fastest possible means. "You have no jurisdiction here," Benjamin blustered, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Actually, I do. Mrs. Blackthorne's appeal was filed in federal court, which gives me full authority to investigate." Parker's eyes were steel gray in the moonlight. "Sheriff Morrison, you're under arrest for armed robbery, conspiracy, and perjury." Morrison started to reach for his gun, but one of the marshals was faster. The sheriff found himself staring down the barrel of a Colt .45. "And you, Mr. Blackthorne," Parker continued, "are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery of public officials, and accessory to murder." "Murder?" Benjamin's voice cracked slightly. "Mrs. Chen didn't die of natural causes. The Denver coroner found traces of arsenic in her hair samples, enough to kill a horse, administered slowly over several weeks. Clara felt her knees go weak. Mrs. Chen had been murdered, poisoned slowly and deliberately to silence her before she could expose the conspiracy." "You can't prove any of this," Benjamin said desperately. "We don't have to prove it tonight. We just have to arrest you and let a proper court sort it out." Parker nodded to his marshals. "Take them both into custody." As the marshals moved forward, Benjamin made one last desperate play. He swung his rifle toward Clara, his finger tightening on the trigger. "If I can't have the land, nobody can." Everett didn't think. He threw himself sideways, pushing Clara out of the line of fire just as the rifle boomed. The bullet meant for his wife took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. Clara screamed his name, falling to her knees beside him as blood spread across his shirt. The marshals subdued Benjamin quickly, wresting the rifle away from him before he could fire again. "Everett, stay with me," Clara whispered, pressing her hands against the wound to slow the bleeding. "Don't you dare die on me now." "Not planning to," he managed, his voice tight with pain. "We've got a marriage to figure out, remember?" Judge Parker knelt beside them, his experienced eyes assessing the wound. "It's bad, but not fatal if we get him to a doctor quickly. Can you ride?" "If I have to." "You have to. We need to get all of you to Denver, where you'll be safe while this gets sorted out." As they helped Everett onto a horse, Clara riding beside him to steady him, Benjamin called out from where the marshals held him. "This isn't over. You think taking me down changes anything? There are others, more powerful than me. They'll never let you live to testify." "Let me worry about that," Judge Parker replied calmly. Right now, you need to worry about explaining to a federal jury why you thought murder was an acceptable business practice. As they rode out of Red Hollow, Clara looked back at the town that had nearly been her grave. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink. A new day and a new beginning. "Are you really going to be okay?" she asked Everett, who was managing to stay in the saddle despite his injury. "Ask me again when we get to Denver," he said. "But yeah, I think I am. We both are." Clara smiled, feeling truly free for the first time in months. They had a long journey ahead of them and an uncertain future. But they were alive, they were together, and the truth was finally coming to light. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything. 6 months later, Clara stood on the front porch of their small ranch outside Denver, watching Everett work with a young colt in the corral. His shoulder had healed well, though he still favored it on cold mornings. The scar served as a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything, but also of how much they'd gained. The trials had taken 3 months. Benjamin Blackthorne and Sheriff Morrison were both convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The Territorial Development Association was exposed and disbanded, its members scattered to the winds or facing their own legal troubles. Mrs. Chen's murder conviction had carried a death sentence for Benjamin, but Clara had asked Judge Parker to commute it to life imprisonment. She'd seen enough death and wanted no more, even for the man who'd orchestrated her father's ruin. The Vance property had been returned to Clara, along with compensation for the illegal seizure, but she'd sold it immediately, using the money to buy their new ranch in Colorado, far from the memories and influences of Red Hollow. "Mrs. Blackthorne," a voice called from behind her. Clara turned to see Judge Parker approaching, his familiar figure welcome as always. He'd become something of a family friend in the months since the trial, checking on them periodically and ensuring their safety as the legal aftermath continued to unfold. "Judge Parker, what brings you all the way out here?" "Good news, mostly. The last of the association's appeals have been denied. You and Everett are officially safe from any further legal harassment." Clara felt a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying lift from her shoulders. "It's really over?" "It's really over." Parker smiled, removing his hat. "There's something else, though. The territorial governor wants to offer Everett a position as a federal marshal. Seems his experience uncovering corruption has impressed some important people in Washington." Clara looked out at her husband, who was patiently working with the colt, his voice low and gentle as he coaxed the young horse to trust him. "What did you tell them?" "That he'd have to discuss it with his wife, of course. But between you and me, the territory could use more honest lawmen like him." Everett had finished with the colt and was walking toward the house, his long stride covering the ground quickly. When he saw Judge Parker, his face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Judge, what brings you to our little corner of paradise?" "Official business, mostly, but also wanted to see how married life was treating you both." Everett's arm slipped around Clara's waist, a gesture so natural it might have been rehearsed for years instead of months. "Can't complain. Though I never thought I'd enjoy being a rancher this much." "Speaking of which," Clara said, "the judge has some interesting news about a job offer." They discussed the marshal position over dinner, weighing the opportunities against the risks. In the end, it was Clara who made the decision. "Take it," she said firmly. "What we went through in Red Hollow, other people are going through the same thing right now. If you can help stop it, you should. It would mean travel, danger. It would mean doing what's right. That's why I married you, Everett Blackthorne. Well, one of the reasons." He smiled, reaching across the table to take her hand. The simple gold band still looked perfect on her finger, though its meaning had deepened far beyond their desperate bargain in that jail cell. "What are the other reasons?" he asked. "I'll tell you later," she said, blushing slightly. "When we don't have company," Judge Parker laughed, standing to take his leave. "I can see when I'm not wanted. I'll tell the governor you'll take the position." "Tell him Marshall and Mrs. Blackthorne will be proud to serve," Everett replied. After Parker left, they sat on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains, the same peaceful moment they'd shared every evening since settling in Colorado. But tonight felt different, like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked quietly. "Everything you gave up for me?" Everett considered the question seriously, as he always did. "I gave up a fortune built on other people's suffering. I gave up a family that valued money more than human life. I gave up a future that would have made me complicit in evil." He squeezed her hand. "What exactly am I supposed to regret? Your easy life, your social position, the certainty of wealth and comfort. Clara, look at me." When she turned to face him, he continued, "I have a woman who married me when I was risking everything, who trusted me when she had every reason not to, who chose to build a life with me instead of just being grateful for rescue. I have work that matters, a home we built together, and a future that's ours to shape." He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing the gold band that had become a symbol of so much more than legal protection. "If that's not wealth, I don't know what is." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude for the man who'd saved her life, and then discovered she'd saved his right back. "I love you," she said simply. "I know that wasn't part of our original bargain, but—" "It wasn't part of mine either," he interrupted. "But it's the best part of what we became." As the stars came out over the Colorado mountains, Clara reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. A desperate proposal in a jail cell had become a real marriage. A woman facing death had become a federal marshal's wife. A man who'd lost his family had found something better, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and a love that had grown from the most unlikely soil. Tomorrow, Everett would pin on his marshal's badge and begin hunting down the kind of corruption that had nearly destroyed them both. It would be dangerous work, but they'd face it together, as they'd faced everything else since that first desperate night when she'd whispered her impossible offer through iron bars. "If you save me from this cage, I'll marry you." Neither of them had known then that the cage was bigger than a jail cell, or that salvation would come not from one person saving another, but from two people saving each other. But they knew it now, and it was enough to build a lifetime on.